Today, we're going to be focusing on our organization of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and we'll go through some of the basic types of organization within each of those systems, and hopefully this will be a nice introduction as we begin to talk about the circuits and the specific processes that are involved within each of the sections that we present today. So I'll go in straight to lecture 2. We'll talk about organization and function of the central nervous system first, and then we'll go ahead and follow up with the organization and function of the peripheral nervous system. So starting with the central nervous system, also referenced with CNS, the main 4 structures that we've divided the central nervous system up to is the cortical structures, and so these are areas within the cortex. The subcortical structures, which as the name implies, are structures that are beneath the cortex. The cerebellum, which I'm pointing to here, and the brainstem. Of the cortical structures, we have several that we're identifying today. The primary motor cortex being one of the main ones that will be highly involved with the types of movements and motor function that we'll be discussing in an upcoming lecture. The primary somatosensory cortex, and this region is a critical area for the input that comes in to guide the primary motor cortex. The primary auditory cortex, which processes auditory information. The primary visual cortex, which processes all the visual input that comes in, and association areas, which we'll go into in a little bit of detail in just a sec. So to get started, I'll give you a little more information of the primary motor cortex first. Here I'm showing you an image of the precentral gyrus, and here it's in purple. This is the primary motor cortex, or the motor strip. I'm showing you an image here to the left of that primary motor area, which is depicting different regions that are represented within the motor cortex. And so, for example, you'll see that more laterally we have the face being represented, more medially we have the leg and the lower limbs being represented, and the hand being represented with the large area of that cortex. So the primary motor cortex is one of the main regions that sends commands to the brainstem and to the spinal cord to execute the voluntary movements that we have in our day-to-day lives. And the source for these descending motor pathways are projecting to lower levels of the motor system. And so this includes the systems that connect to our limbs and actually get us to function, to behave and move in the way that we intend. The organization of the motor system is referred to as being somatotopically organized. And so what this means is that different regions of the primary motor cortex are responsible for different areas of the body and controlling different parts of the body. And so this is what I was showing you in the smaller image below the brain, which is more medially, the area of the motor cortex is controlling the legs and the feet and the lower limbs, and you have a large area that seems to be controlling the hand. And so this could also be interpreted as the more fine-tuned and precise the motor control is necessary, the more area in the brain is dedicated to processing and controlling that area of the body. As you can see, the face, and particularly the tongue, also has a whole lot of area dedicated to it. And so this highly important real estate being dedicated to the face, and particularly, as you can see, the tongue, is representing the precision of movements of the tongue. And as you can imagine, the many precise movements that are important and required in order for us to have the kind of language abilities that we do have and to produce the smooth um, talk as I'm producing right now. Going on to the primary somatosensory cortex. This region is on the other side of the precentral gyrus. So this is the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. And this is the first region of the cortex to receive incoming sensory information. So here we've labeled it in blue, as you can see in this image of the brain. And this region is also somatotopically organized. So different regions of the sensory cortex are responsible for processing different parts of the body. And so, similar to what we just discussed with the primary motor cortex, areas of the body that require more precise sensation have larger regions that are dedicated to it. And here I'm showing you both for the motor and sensory strip, the homunculus, which is a brain map representation of the human body that, in other words, is almost like a map showing the areas that have greater dedication to them for both sensory processing and motor processing. And the proportion that is dedicated for those brain areas is in proportion to the area that's represented in the brain. And here we have the primary auditory cortex, whose main function is to process incoming sound. And this area is located in the Heschel's gyrus in the temporal lobe, and specifically in the superior temporal gyrus. And here I've labeled it in pink in this image that I'm showing you of the brain and where this primary auditory cortex resides. And as you can see, similar to the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, the auditory cortex also has a specific organization. And here we refer to it as tonotopically organized. And what this means is that there's a gradient that's extending between the neurons that are responding to high frequency versus those that respond to low frequency sounds. So here we have 500 hertz up until 1600 hertz. And so this range of frequencies that are responsible for processing and being in tuned with the frequencies that are coming in are not random. And in fact, they have a specific organization that represents the type of sound that we're hearing. The fourth area that I wanted to discuss with you guys is the primary visual cortex. And this visual cortex is the area that processes all the visual input that's coming in. It's located in the occipital lobe, and so it's the very back of the brain. And I have the image of the occipital lobe here. And what I'm showing you is the primary visual cortex, as well as the secondary cortices that are involved with processing vision. And this area receives the main signals that come from the eye into the retina and the optical tract. And so coming through the optical nerve back to the cortex, which is where it ends up to have the higher level processing. As you can see, I've also labeled the LGN, and so this is a part of the thalamus. And so input that comes in from the eye stops over and is relayed back to the brain, where it's then processed further. And so the organization here, similar to the organization of the past few sensory cortices that we've discussed, is specific to the visual image that's being formed on the retina. So it's organized in such a way that areas that are close to each other in the actual receptive field or in the actual visual area that's being taken in are close to each other in the areas that are responsible within the primary visual cortex to actually process those regions. There's also association areas, which are very important and the areas of the cortex that are truly doing the hard work, I would say. And what I mean by that is these are the areas in the cerebral cortex that bring together the different senses. And so they link and they integrate the primary motor, sensory, auditory, and visual input that we're getting in order for the higher types of mental functions and the complex processing to occur. These association areas can be divided up into three major types. The first is unimodal, and what that means is that there's one type of information being processed by these cells. And it's usually close to the actual primary area, primary cortex that it's connected to. So, for example, if it was near a motor cortex, then it would be highly involved with motor processing, but not the primary area that's getting the start of the message that's being sent down. The second is polymodal, and polymodal is representing two or more kinds of sensory information that are being processed. And these are usually located also close to the unimodal areas that are further processing the primary motor areas. Supramodal refers to areas that are processing not only the sensory or motor function, but involved with prefrontal areas such as the execution of function, decision making, and other even more complex functions that are not one or a few types of senses put together. What I wanted to present to you here is an example of a language association area. And so, as you can imagine, language is a combination of multiple forms of sensations that we're taking in. And so, language can be visual for reading or sign language. We could have a touch be involved if someone who's blind is reading as Braille, as well as hearing, of course. So Wernicke's area is understanding spoken, written, and sign language. And so this area that is an association area that's close to other regions such as the auditory cortex that bring input from the actual sounds that we're hearing to then further process it into actual language to be able to understand it. Broca's area is the production of language, and that's where that area is processed. And as you can see in the image that I've shown here, it's close to the primary motor cortex, where then the actual production of language gets executed. The next area that I wanted to discuss with you is the subcortical structures. And these structures have multiple functions. They can be motor or non-motor. A lot of the motor types of functions that are involved with these structures have to do with the emotional, the motivation aspect of the actual movement. And so, for example, individuals who have damage in these areas have trouble with initiation of movement, have trouble with the actual quality of the movement, and a lot of times lead to issues that are also non-motor issues. So for example, just the attention to be able to listen to instructions about movement or instructions about cognitive tasks are also involved with these structures. So emotion, motivation, attention, and memory are a combination of types of functions that these structures are responsible for. I'll mention some of the few and I'll go through them with you. So the hippocampus is the main area that's involved with memory and memory processing. A lot of spatial memory as well as episodic memory, which involves information such as what you ate for lunch yesterday and what you're going to be planning to do tomorrow, are also part of what the hippocampus is responsible for. The amygdala is well known for its processing of emotion, and a lot of time um, its connection with taking emotions that are tied with memories and making connections and processes to the hippocampus that allows for memories that are emotional to be more strongly formed. The thalamus is the relay station. So a lot of input that comes in prior to getting to the cortex, it actually stops at the thalamus for the first stop that it makes before it enters the cortex for the higher level processing that occurs. The hypothalamus is the main structure that's involved with a lot of hormonal activities. And so one of the areas that the hypothalamus is involved with is eating, satiation, and hunger. The basal ganglia is a key region that's involved with motor behavior, and it has various functions, and a lot of recent research is showing us the basal ganglia is not only involved with just the basic aspects of movement, but in fact the initiation and the motivation of movement. The insular cortex and the cingulate gyrus are actually paired up a lot of the times, and they are areas of the brain that are responsible for attention and for taking the importance or salience of an activity or input that's coming in and attributing the appropriate amount of attention to it. For example, let's say you are in a lecture and you hear your name. Your insular cortex and cingulate gyrus are both responsible for you to be hyper alert, to begin to listen even more so than you were before, to pick up any important information that might be more relevant to you since you just heard your name, and the information that's coming may be more critical for you to pay attention to. The next structure is the cerebellum. And the main function of the cerebellum is coordination and sequencing of movements, as well as some aspects of cognition. So recent literature has also showed us that the cerebellum is involved with a lot of motivation as well, and specifically when we're talking about motivation of movement. And so taking, for example, a individual that learns that whenever the alarm goes off, you have to get out of bed, coordinating the cue of the alarm to actual movements of the body and the limbs are one of the areas that the cerebellum is involved with. So next time you wake up in the morning, you get out of the bed appropriately without tripping, you can thank your cerebellum for that. It's located at the rear of your brain, and so if you hold on to the back of your brain, back of your head, just above your neck, that is where your cerebellum is sitting. And last note that I've made on the slide is that it's connected with the cortex. And so going back to what I was mentioning about its importance with the motivation of movement and the coordination of movement, the connection that it has with the cortex allows for a lot of the proper sequencing of events to happen. One of the most primitive regions of our central nervous system is the brainstem. And this brainstem functions to regulate the basic bodily functions such as breathing, heart rate, swallowing, and blood pressure. And this area is located between the subcortical structures and the spinal cord. And it's made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. My slide skipped a few. Here we go. This area is also the origin of the cranial nerves, which we will talk about when we talk about peripheral nervous system. And here we are. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of spinal nerves and cranial nerves. And spinal nerves are the cell bodies that are in the spinal cord, whereas the cranial nerves are the cell bodies that are in the brainstem. Giving you a little bit more detail about what the spinal nerves are responsible for, the spinal nerves are the link between the brain and the body. And so, in other words, it is the connection that takes information from the periphery and from the environment, both environment of the external environment, the outside of our body, and internal environment within our body, so within our organs. And it carries both the motor and sensory information. And so it has ascending sensory nerve fibers, and so this is information that's coming in. And it has descending motor nerve fibers, and so this is the commands that are then being put out. Here I'm showing you a section of the spinal cord. This is the dorsal side, and this is the ventral side. And so in other words, this is the back, and this is the front. And I'm showing you in black a sensory nerve that's coming in through the dorsal horn, and a motor nerve that's then coming out from the ventral side, so the ventral horn. And that'll be important to know. This is another image showing a section of the spinal cord. And these are the dorsal root ganglion, which are, in other words, the sensory input, the sensory fibers. And these are the ventral, or the motor fibers that are coming out. An example that I want to share with you to put this in perspective is, let's say, for example, you're walking to class. And as you're walking to class, you step on something that seems to be pretty sharp enough to go through your shoe. And before you completely step your foot down all the way, you pick up your leg as to not get injured or hurt. In order for that to happen, both the sensory information that came in from the ascending nerve fibers through the dorsal horn gave information from the periphery, from the outside world, external environment, that there's something sharp, that's something that needs to be attended to. And that information then gave over to the command for the motor nerve fibers to then move your leg and prevent you from getting hurt. And so it's a combination of these spinal nerves that allows for those types of circuits to happen and to happen smoothly and successfully. The cranial nerves are nerves that are innervating muscles of the head, the neck, the face, the tongue, and some other areas that are also involved with language. Some of them are sensory only, and some of them are motor only, and there are some cranial nerves that are both sensory and motor as well. Here I'm showing you two images of where the cranial nerves reside. And so this is looking from the bottom of the brain, and this is looking from the front of the brain stem. And we'll go through this in a little bit more detail in a few lectures from now. So in a few weeks, you'll learn a little bit more about each of these nerves and what their functions are. But what I wanted to highlight is that these cranial nerves are essential for speech. And there are 7 in particular that play a role in speech and swallowing that I've highlighted here by the green squares over those cranial nerves. There's 12 total cranial nerves, and 7 of those are the critical ones that play a role in speech and swallowing. And so the trigeminal, the facial, the hypoglossal, accessory, the vagus nerve, the glossopharyngeal, and the vestibulocochlear are also amongst those. And I've highlighted some of the main functions, so you can also become a little more familiar with them. That is it for today's lecture, and I look forward to discussing this material with you in a little bit more depth.